"We have a problem! We have a problem! We're going up!" The desperate voice of First Officer Pierre-Cédric Bonin crackles through the radio as Air France Flight 447 begins its terrifying 4.5-minute descent into the depths of the Atlantic Ocean. What started as a routine overnight flight from Rio de Janeiro to Paris would become one of aviation's most haunting mysteries, a tragedy that would claim 228 lives and forever change how we understand the delicate relationship between man and machine at 35,000 feet. Tonight, we take you inside the cockpit during those final devastating moments when 3 experienced pilots found themselves trapped in a technological nightmare, fighting desperately against forces they couldn't fully comprehend, as their Airbus A330 fell silently through the darkness toward an unforgiving sea. The date was May 31, 2009, and the atmosphere at Rio de Janeiro's Tom Jobim International Airport carried that familiar buzz of international travel. Passengers from around the world gathered in the departure lounge, clutching boarding passes for Air France Flight 447, many of them unaware they were about to become part of one of commercial aviation's most profound tragedies. The aircraft waiting for them on the tarmac was a state-of-the-art Airbus A330-200, registration FGZZCP, a technological marvel that represented the pinnacle of modern aviation engineering. This particular aircraft had been in service for just 4 years, accumulating over 18,000 flight hours with an exemplary safety record. Its twin Rolls-Royce Trent 700 engines hummed with quiet efficiency as ground crews completed their final preparations, loading luggage and supplies for the 3,400-mile journey across the Atlantic that should have taken approximately 11 hours. Inside the cockpit, 3 highly qualified pilots prepared for what they expected would be another routine transatlantic crossing. Captain Marc Dubois, 58 years old, brought with it over 11,000 flight hours of experience, including more than 1,500 hours on the A330. His reputation within Air France was stellar, known for his calm demeanor and methodical approach to flying. Joining him was First Officer Pierre-Cédric Bonin, 32, with 2,900 total flight hours, and Relief First Officer David Robert, 37, who carried 6,500 hours of flying experience. Together, they represented a formidable team of aviation professionals, each trained to handle the complexities of modern commercial flight operations. The pre-flight briefing revealed typical weather patterns for the season, with some thunderstorm activity expected over the intertropical convergence zone, that band of weather systems where the northern and southern hemisphere trade winds meet, creating towering cumulonimbus clouds that commercial aircraft routinely navigate around. At 7:29 p.m. local time, with the sun setting over Guanabara Bay, Flight 447 pushed back from the gate, its passengers settling in for what they believed would be an uneventful overnight journey to the City of Light. The cabin crew, led by Chief Purser Fabrice Coppola, ensured everyone was comfortable as the massive aircraft taxied toward runway 10. Among the 216 passengers were business travelers returning from meetings in Brazil, tourists completing their South American adventures, and families heading home to France. There were couples on honeymoons, students returning to university, and working professionals who had made this journey dozens of times before. Each carried their own stories, dreams, and plans for the future that awaited them in Paris. None could have imagined that within the next few hours their flight would disappear from radar screens and vanish into the night, launching one of the most extensive search and rescue operations in aviation history. The takeoff proceeded flawlessly, with Captain Dubois applying full power to the Trent engines as the A330 accelerated down the runway, its advanced fly-by-wire systems monitoring every parameter as the aircraft lifted gracefully into the Brazilian evening. The climb out over the Atlantic was smooth and routine, with air traffic control clearing them to their initial cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. As they settled into the cruise phase of flight, the autopilot engaged, and the sophisticated flight management system began navigating along the predetermined route that would take them northeast across the Atlantic, following established air traffic corridors that commercial aircraft had used safely for decades. The passengers, many already asleep or settling in with books and entertainment systems, had no idea they were flying toward a convergence of meteorological conditions that would soon challenge every system aboard their aircraft and test the skills of their flight crew beyond anything they had ever experienced. For the first 3 hours and 28 minutes of Flight 447, everything proceeded exactly as planned. The aircraft cruised smoothly through the night sky, its passengers comfortable and secure, while the flight crew monitored weather reports and communicated with air traffic control centers across the Atlantic. Captain Dubois had even taken his scheduled rest break, leaving First Officers Bonin and Robert to handle the routine cruise phase of the flight. The aircraft's weather radar showed the familiar pattern of thunderstorm activity ahead, towering columns of cumulonimbus clouds that stretched toward the edge of space, their tops reaching above 50,000 feet. This was nothing unusual for flights along this route during the rainy season, and the crew prepared to navigate around the worst of the weather, using their aircraft's sophisticated weather detection equipment. They had done this countless times before, following established procedures that allowed commercial aircraft to safely circumvent dangerous weather while maintaining their planned route and schedule. But at 2:10 a.m. UTC on June 1, 2009, approximately 590 miles northeast of the Fernando de Noronha Islands, Flight 447 encountered a massive complex of thunderstorms that stretched across their flight path like a wall of turbulent air and ice crystals. The aircraft's weather radar painted an ominous picture on the cockpit displays, showing areas of intense precipitation and wind shear that required careful navigation. As they approached the storm system, ice crystals began forming on the aircraft's external sensors, including the crucial pitot tubes that measure airspeed by comparing the pressure of incoming air with static air pressure. These sophisticated sensors, manufactured by Thales and installed on aircraft around the world, had a known vulnerability to ice crystal formation in certain atmospheric conditions, something that aviation authorities and aircraft manufacturers were still working to fully understand and address through design improvements. The first sign of trouble came at 2:10:05 a.m. when the autopilot and autothrust systems suddenly disconnected, accompanied by a series of warning chimes that immediately captured the attention of First Officers Bonin and Robert. The aircraft's flight management computers had detected inconsistent airspeed readings from the 3 independent pitot tubes, a condition that made the automated systems unable to maintain control of the aircraft. In the world of modern aviation, this should have been a manageable situation for experienced pilots, who train regularly in simulators to handle various system failures and emergency scenarios. The established procedure was clear and straightforward: maintain level flight attitude, keep the engines at cruise power, and wait for the airspeed indications to return to normal as the aircraft cleared the icing conditions that were affecting the sensors. However, what happened next defied every principle of aviation safety and demonstrated how quickly a routine situation can spiral into catastrophe when human factors combine with technical failures in unexpected ways. Instead of maintaining level flight, First Officer Bonin, who was the pilot flying at the time, pulled back sharply on his side stick controller, commanding the aircraft to climb rapidly from their cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. This was the opposite of what the situation required, and it initiated a chain of events that would prove impossible to reverse. The A330's Advanced Flight Control System, designed to protect the aircraft from dangerous flight attitudes, was unable to provide its normal protections because it too relied on accurate airspeed information to function properly. Without reliable airspeed data, the aircraft's sophisticated fly-by-wire system reverted to a degraded control mode that placed the full responsibility for safe flight directly in the hands of the pilots. As Flight 447 climbed rapidly through 37,000 feet, the aircraft's angle of attack increased dramatically, causing the smooth airflow over the wings to separate and creating a deep aerodynamic stall. The stall warnings began sounding almost immediately, but in a cruel irony of engineering design, these warnings were programmed to stop when the computer determined that the airspeed indications were unreliable. This meant that during the most critical moments of the flight, when the pilots desperately needed to understand their aircraft's condition, the stall warning system fell silent, creating a false impression that the stall condition had been resolved. The reality was far different. The massive Airbus was now falling through the night sky like a 233-ton brick, its wings no longer generating the lift needed to sustain flight, while its 3 engines continued to run normally, creating the illusion that the aircraft was still under control. Captain Dubois, awakened by the commotion and the unusual flight characteristics, rushed back to the cockpit to find his aircraft in an impossible situation. The altimeter was showing a rapid descent, the vertical speed indicator pegged at its maximum downward reading. and his two first officers were struggling to understand what was happening to their aircraft. The cockpit voice recorder would later reveal the confusion and mounting panic in their voices as they tried to make sense of instruments that seemed to be providing contradictory information. "I have the impression that we have some crazy speeds here," First Officer Robert said, his voice tight with stress as he watched the flight displays showing impossible combinations of altitude, airspeed, and vertical speed. The aircraft was now in what aerodynamicists call a deep stall, a condition where the wings are so angled to the airflow that they cannot generate lift, regardless of how much power is applied to the engines. The tragedy of Flight 447 was not just mechanical failure, but a breakdown in crew resource management and situational awareness that demonstrated how even experienced pilots can become disoriented when faced with unfamiliar emergency scenarios. As the aircraft continued its terrifying descent through the tropical night, with its nose pointed slightly upward in a deceptively normal attitude, the three pilots struggled to diagnose their situation and apply the correct recovery techniques. The solution was actually quite simple and well known to aviation professionals: lower the nose to reduce the angle of attack, allow the wings to regain their grip on the air, and let the aircraft's natural stability restore normal flight. But in the stress and confusion of the moment, with multiple warning systems activating and instrument readings that seemed to make no sense, the crew was unable to recognize that they were in a classic stall scenario that required immediate and decisive action. The cockpit voice recorder captured increasingly desperate communications as the crew realized their aircraft was in serious trouble. "We're going to crash! This can't be happening!" First Officer Bonin exclaimed as the reality of their situation began to sink in. Captain Dubois, trying to regain control of the situation, took over the controls from Bonin, but by this time the aircraft had fallen too far and lost too much energy to recover. The Atlantic Ocean, invisible in the darkness below, was rising up to meet them at a rate of over 10,000 feet per minute. Despite having nearly 2 miles of altitude when the crisis began, they had less than 4.5 minutes to solve a problem that would have challenged even the most experienced test pilots in ideal conditions, with full knowledge of their aircraft's actual state. At 2:11:40 a.m., just 95 seconds after the autopilot disconnected, Captain Dubois made a desperate attempt to understand their situation. "What's this? What's happening?" he asked, his voice reflecting the confusion that had taken hold of the cockpit. The aircraft was now passing through 29,000 feet in its uncontrolled descent, its angle of attack exceeding 40 degrees, a condition so extreme that the wings were creating more drag than lift, essentially turning the aircraft into an enormous air brake falling through the sky. The engines, still running at high power settings, were unable to arrest the descent because thrust alone cannot overcome the fundamental aerodynamic problem of stalled wings. This is a lesson taught in basic flight training, but in the stress and confusion of the emergency, with limited visibility and contradictory instrument indications, the crew was unable to apply this fundamental principle of flight. The final minutes of Flight 447 revealed the human tragedy behind the technical failure. As three professional pilots, who had dedicated their careers to aviation safety, found themselves trapped in an impossible situation with insufficient time and information to execute a recovery. First Officer Robert, recognizing the severity of their predicament, attempted to take control from Bonin, but the coordination between the pilots broke down completely as each tried to apply different inputs to save their aircraft. The Airbus A330's flight control system, designed to prevent pilot error in normal operations, was unable to protect them in this degraded mode, where the pilot's inputs were directly translated to the control surfaces without the computer's normal interpretation and protection algorithms. This meant that contradictory control inputs from multiple pilots could actually fight against each other, further complicating an already desperate situation. As Flight 447 descended through 10,000 feet, the crew made one final frantic attempt to recover control of their aircraft. "Pull up! Pull up!" the ground proximity warning system commanded, its synthetic voice adding to the cacophony of alarms filling the cockpit. But pulling up was exactly the wrong response to their situation. The aircraft needed to push its nose down to break the stall and regain flying speed. In those final moments, as the Black Atlantic rushed up to meet them, Captain Dubois finally understood what had happened to his aircraft. 10 degrees of pitch attitude, he announced, recognizing that despite the nose being pointed slightly upward, the aircraft was falling vertically through the air like a dropped stone, its wings completely stalled and unable to provide any lift whatsoever. The last recorded words from Flight 447 came from First Officer Robert. "This can't be happening." At 2:14:28 a.m., just 4 minutes and 23 seconds after the crisis began, the aircraft struck the surface of the Atlantic Ocean at a vertical speed of over 107 miles per hour. The impact was instantaneous and catastrophic, with the massive Airbus disintegrating on contact with the water and disappearing beneath the waves, along with all 228 souls on board. The ocean depth at the crash site was over 13,000 feet, making immediate recovery of wreckage and human remains impossible with the technology available in 2009. For the families of the victims, this meant years of waiting, uncertainty, and grief as search teams scoured thousands of square miles of ocean in an attempt to locate the aircraft and understand what had caused such a modern airliner to simply vanish from the sky. The disappearance of Flight 447 launched one of the most extensive and expensive search operations in aviation history, involving ships and aircraft from multiple nations, deep-sea submersibles, and cutting-edge underwater search technology. The first pieces of wreckage were discovered floating on the surface 5 days after the crash, confirming the worst fears of investigators and families alike. But the main wreckage, including the crucial flight data recorders that would hold the key to understanding what happened during those final minutes, lay on the ocean floor nearly 2.5 miles below the surface, beyond the reach of conventional salvage operations. It would take nearly 2 years and multiple search expeditions before the black boxes were finally located and recovered, their data intact despite spending months in the crushing depths of the Atlantic Ocean. When investigators finally analyzed the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder information, the truth about Flight 447 was more disturbing than anyone had imagined. This was not a case of mechanical failure or severe weather overwhelming a commercial airliner, but rather a tragic example of how confusion, stress, and inadequate training can lead to the loss of situational awareness in the cockpit of a modern aircraft. The pilots had literally flown a perfectly functional airplane into the ocean because they were unable to recognize and recover from a basic aerodynamic stall, a maneuver that should have been routine for commercial airline pilots. The pitot tubes had been blocked by ice crystals for only a few minutes at the beginning of the emergency, but the crew's inappropriate response to this relatively minor technical problem had created a far more serious situation that ultimately became unsurvivable. The investigation revealed multiple contributing factors to the tragedy, including design issues with the pitot tubes that made them susceptible to ice crystal icing, inadequate training procedures that didn't prepare pilots for high-altitude stall scenarios in modern fly-by-wire aircraft, and human factors problems related to stress, confusion, and crew coordination during emergency situations. The stall warning system's design, which stopped sounding when airspeed indications were unreliable, was identified as a particular problem that may have contributed to the crew's inability to recognize their actual flight condition. Additionally, the investigation found that Airbus had not adequately trained pilots on how their aircraft would behave in degraded control modes, where the computer's normal flight envelope protections were not available to prevent dangerous flight attitudes. The loss of Flight 447 led to significant changes in aviation safety procedures, aircraft design standards, and pilot training requirements around the world. Airlines began implementing enhanced simulator training programs specifically focused on high-altitude upset recovery and manual flying skills, recognizing that modern pilots had become too dependent on automated systems and might not be prepared to take manual control during unusual emergency scenarios. Aircraft manufacturers redesigned pitot tube heating systems and developed new ice detection technologies to prevent the kind of sensor failures that initiated the Flight 447 emergency. The stall warning system logic was also modified to ensure that pilots would continue to receive critical flight envelope warnings, even when airspeed indications were unreliable. Perhaps most importantly, the tragedy highlighted the need for what aviation psychologists call resilience training, helping pilots maintain situational awareness and decision-making capability under extreme stress conditions. The investigation showed that all 3 pilots aboard Flight 447 were technically qualified and experienced, but they were unable to step back from the immediate crisis and apply basic aerodynamic principles to their situation. This led to new training methodologies that emphasize threat and error management, teaching pilots not just what to do in specific emergency scenarios, but how to think through problems systematically and maintain control of their aircraft, even when faced with multiple system failures and time pressure that would challenge anyone's cognitive abilities. The families of the 228 people who died aboard Flight 447 faced years of legal battles, grief, and unanswered questions as investigators worked to piece together the final moments of their loved ones. Many criticized Air France and Airbus for inadequate training and design flaws that contributed to the accident, arguing that the aviation industry had placed too much emphasis on technological solutions while neglecting the human factors that remain crucial to flight safety. The settlement of legal claims took nearly a decade, with families eventually receiving compensation for their losses, though no amount of money could restore what they had lost, or ease the pain of knowing that their family members had spent their final minutes in terror as their aircraft fell helplessly toward the ocean. The story of Flight 447 serves as a sobering reminder that aviation safety requires constant vigilance, continuous learning from mistakes, and recognition that even the most advanced technology cannot eliminate the need for skilled, well-trained human beings who can think clearly under pressure and make life or death decisions in seconds. The 228 people who boarded that flight in Rio de Janeiro were ordinary passengers who trusted that the aviation system would deliver them safely to their destination, just as millions of other passengers do every day. Their tragedy was not in vain, if the lessons learned from their loss help prevent similar accidents and make flying safer for future generations. As we remember Flight 447 and honor the memory of everyone who was lost that night over the Atlantic, we must acknowledge both how far aviation safety has progressed and how much work remains to be done. Every flight that takes off today benefits from the painful lessons learned from this tragedy and countless others throughout aviation history. The pilots, flight attendants, and passengers who died aboard that Airbus A330 contributed to our understanding of flight safety in ways they never intended, and their legacy lives on in the improved training, better technology, and enhanced procedures that now protect every commercial flight around the world. If you found this investigation into one of aviation's most tragic mysteries compelling, please consider subscribing to our channel where we continue to explore the stories behind aviation accidents and the lessons they teach us about the ongoing pursuit of safer skies for everyone who flies.